So, hi everyone and welcome. Let us begin. Why do people vote for governments that are accused of weakening democratic institutions? Why do movements that challenge liberal norms often enjoy deep and enduring popular support? Across Europe and beyond, societies are grappling with rising political polarization, growing distrust in institutions, and competing visions of democracy, nationhood, and sovereignty. Few countries illustrate these tensions more vividly than Poland. And well, first of all, hi, I'm Emily, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the EU Values Network. We're a research network dedicated to understanding the values that shape European governance and its place in the world. If today's discussion sparks your interest, I would really recommend you to visit our website, explore our wider program of webinars, blogs, podcasts, and such there. And well, today we have the pleasure of discussing the recently published book, Good Change, The Rise and Fall of Poland's Illiberal Revolution, a fascinating piece of research that examines one of the most consequential political transformations in contemporary Europe. As many of you watching live will be aware, there's been remarkable change in Poland's governance over the last decade. Understanding Poland is useful for understanding then the broader political developments across Europe and other democracies around the world. And to guide us through this, we're really delighted to welcome Stanley Bill and Ben Stanley, authors of this book. To start, I will introduce them a little bit. Stanley Bill is a professor of Polish studies at the University of Cambridge. He is one of the foremost international experts on Poland, whose work bridges politics, history, culture, and intellectual life. Alongside his academic research, he is also the founder and editor-at-large of Notes from Poland, a widely respected source of analysis and reporting on Polish affairs. We're also grateful to be joined by Ben Stanley, Associate Professor at SWPS University in Warsaw. Ben is one of Europe's top experts on populism, whose research explores how political parties represent citizens, compete for power, and reshape democratic politics. His work has helped define how scholars understand populism itself, so we're really excited to have him with us in the room today, the virtual room. And well, few scholars have done more to help international audiences understand the political and cultural transformation that has shaped Poland in recent years, making, both all of you actually exceptionally well placed to guide us through the story and the research that's being told in Good Change. So thank you for being here. And we're also honoured to welcome our discussant with us today, Alexandra Sochtka from Charles III University of Madrid. Alexandra is a political scientist whose research focuses on political behaviour, public opinion, democratic attitudes, and European identities. Her work explores how citizens form political loyalties, how they relate to democratic institutions, and how broader social and cultural changes can shape political participation and support for democracy. And these questions really lie at the heart of many of the issues I think we're going to hear about in Good Change. So we're very much looking forward to her reflections, which we'll come to a little later in this session. And well, everyone that is watching, a little reminder for you that there is an opportunity to ask your questions as well, or just add your comments. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see something, a Q&A box. So feel free at any moment to write in there, and we will return to that towards the end of the session. And well, thank you. Thank you on behalf of the EU Values Network. Thank you all for being here and our great panel today. That's all from me. I guess, Stanley, Ben, over to you if you have a screen to share or any introduction.
Bear with me a moment, I'll get that.
Of course.
Sorted. Okay, that should be visible now. Can you see that okay?
Yes, it's great.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Emily, for that extremely generous introduction and for your work to organize this event. We're really pleased to be here. And thanks, Alexandra, as well, for joining us and for your generosity and the time to engage with our work. So you can see on the screen the image of the cover of our book, Good Change, which already feels like something of a historical study. And it's a study that, of course, engages with a history that is still with us, but nevertheless, something that we conceived of as we were completing the project as to a certain degree an enclosed or completed almost period in time. And that is of the rise of the peace-led government in 2015, its consolidation in 2019, and its fall from power in 2023. So that's really the arc that this book covers. And we were hoping to show something not just about the Polish context, but more broadly, how populist illiberals come to power, how they consolidate power, and how they lose power. And so that's really the questions that this book examines. And we'll just give you a brief overview in the 25 minutes that we have of its contents. Ben.
Okay, so when we first started working on this book, our intention was could be sort of summarized thus. We wanted to get people to take what was happening in Poland seriously, both in the sense of understanding what was actually going on, but also treating it as something which was increasingly part of the political mainstream, as has turned out to be the case in a number of Western European democracies as well. This movement away from adherence to an orthodox model of liberal democracy towards one which was more skeptical both of the institutions and the norms of liberal democratic polities. In many respects, Poland, as was the case in Hungary as well, has been at the forefront of some of these changes, has been something of a pioneer of some of the changes that we've seen that we describe in the book, which have been drawn on often explicitly and imitated elsewhere. So we wanted to provide in the book both an overview of what Law and Justice did with respect to how it explained itself in terms of what it was doing to Polish democracy and its institutions, how it was received, and also with what consequences. We look at the end of the book about what potential lessons can be drawn, and in subsequent work we've also moved to focus on some of the lessons of the good change. But before that, we need to sort of go back to the beginning as such, and to sort of to explain why it was important for us to explain not only what the good change was, but also what its ultimate consequences were. At the time we started writing the book, there was a tendency to see cases of populism as sort of manifestations of an immature democracy, democracy that had not yet internalized fully liberal democratic norms, and whose institutions were, while sort of established on paper, were still quite immature in their functioning and still prone to being undermined. As we've seen not only in the Polish case, but also if we look at events in the US and in the United Kingdom over the last couple of years, we can see substantial changes in that respect, with the undermining of institutions which had been thought to be somewhat more mature and somewhat more stable. So we started by looking at how we got to the good change in the first place. It didn't spring out of nowhere as a kind of populist spasm against the political elite. It dates back to the very beginning of transition, to debates and rivalries that emerged in the early 1990s about the nature of liberal democratic transition after '89, to whose benefit transition had worked, and which political elites had been involved in the process or had been overlooked. So in previous work, Stan had looked at peace as Law and Justice as essentially offering a kind of counter elite, a different way of not only a different way of thinking about post-'89 politics, but also an alternative to the liberal elite that had emerged in the 1990s and had really, for the first certainly decade and a half of post-communist transition, been hegemonic both politically and ideologically. So it was around 2005 when this initial divide between the successors of the post-communist party on the one hand and the post-solidarity parties on the other started to give way to a divide which was somewhat more in keeping with the ways in which the Polish electorate divided itself up ideologically. So we look across the book as a whole at this distinction between the social versus the liberal divide, which underpins both economic divides in Poland, but also sociocultural divides that have come to be politically salient over the last 15 years. So the book begins essentially by explaining how this divide has been mirrored at the popular level. There is this broad distinction between what has been termed Poland A, so this Poland of transition, a Poland that has benefited from transition to a greater extent than the periphery, and a peripheral Poland B of those who are older, less well educated, usually rurally based, tend to be marginalized both in economic terms and also in sociocultural terms, or at least believe themselves to have been. And that this really has been the basis of a divide among voters that mirrors the elite level divide between the two major political parties, Law and Justice and Civic Platform, or Civic Coalition as it's currently constituted. So what we show in the book is that there is a basis for this divide. This divide does exist to a degree in terms of political attitudes and party affiliations, that it is somewhat overdrawn, that this stark divide between Poland A and Poland B is not quite as binary as some have suggested, but that it does map on to salient ideological and socio-demographic tendencies. We then move on to look at having achieved power, having attained power on the basis of an appeal to this left behind electorate, what Law and Justice then ended up trying to do. And so we look firstly at the attack on democratic institutions and the rule of law, which was the process by which Law and Justice were able to make a lot of their new political agenda stick. One of the things they learned from a previous period out of in power was that without being able to neuter key institutions, in particular the Constitutional Tribunal, it was impossible for them to mount a fuller and more comprehensive assault on democratic institutions on the one hand and civil society on the other. And so really right from the beginning of their term in power from 2015 onwards, we see a very comprehensive and coordinated assault on key democratic institutions and a turn towards large-scale executive aggrandizement, the sidelining of parliament, and the emergence of a decisionist mode of political governance in which increasingly both within Parliament and also outside the Parliament, the party's own structures provided the basis for a powerful executive that was able to not so much to override as to simply ignore key institutions.
So at the center of what we claim about peace with respect to their policy platforms and ideology is what we term an unconventional left-right combination, whereby peace combines aspects of policy that would be traditionally identified with the left, in particular, various kinds of redistribution, but also some aspects of protectionism, although to a much lesser degree than the former. And combining that, on the other hand, with cultural politics that we would associate with the traditional conservative right. And PiS did this extremely successfully in Poland. And that's partly due to some specific characteristics of the Polish electorate, that there are many voters in Poland that have somewhat conservative views on cultural questions, whilst at the same time being at least open to the idea that the government should redistribute or make some kind of interventionist action to address inequality in society. But it's also something that clearly is present in electorates across Europe and not just Europe. So this idea that traditional left-right cleavages have long since ceased to function, and therefore that there is space for particularly new political actors to attempt to mobilize new policy combinations. And so we saw in the case of PiS something potentially with broader application, but we also analyzed sort of specifically how this worked and how it succeeded. in PiS's policy platform. So we begin with what PiS calls the Polish model of the welfare state. This is PiS's redistributionist policies, which included the flagship 500 plus child benefit program, which was extremely popular and had a significant impact on reducing child poverty. And this particular cash handout, in conjunction with a range of other policies, in fact, had some impact on what was a declining level of inequality in Poland that can be seen on various measures in the period in which PiS was in government, and extreme forms of poverty as well, and especially in deprived small town and rural areas. So this was an area of policy in which PiS was able to act effectively and act in a way that had a significant impact on everyday lives of a large proportion of the electorate. These were extremely popular policies, and for that reason, we describe what we term a paradigm shift in Polish politics. So from an essentially neoliberal starting point, the idea that the role of the government is to make some attempt to shift inequality, to make some attempt to redistribute resources, has become a position that's at the center of Polish politics today. And what we can see as an example of evidence of that is the fact that in order to come to power in 2023, the coalition of Donald Tusk, and in particular his centrist Liberal Party civic platform or civic coalition, had to adopt a position that was entirely different from its earlier positions on these redistributionist programs. So essentially to take on PiS's policy in order not to frighten away voters who might potentially think about shifting their vote in the 2023 elections or coming out to vote. So this is a sign of policy success and a symptom of an overall paradigm shift that PiS was able to effect in this area. There are various debates, and we can certainly answer questions about those around, how deep this change really was. Was it superficial? Did it really involve an essential privatization of welfare and public services that the state should be providing? Those are interesting questions, but nevertheless, the way these policies were received by significant parts of the electorate was very, very positively, and it increased trust in government, increased a sense of influence over public affairs of many Poles. It created tangible benefits, and it protected PiS from any backlash against what it had been doing that Ben was just describing in institutions. At the same time, and intertwined with this nativist economics, as we call it, and one of the reasons why we describe it as nativist economics is it's not by coincidence that the flagship policy was one that was associated with the family, and this was the name of the policy, Family 500 plus, and associated with childbirth, and discussed in terms of a national community facing a demographic crisis. But what we see in multiple dimensions is the intertwining of this nativist economics with the rhetoric of cultural conservatism, of nativism, traditional Catholic ideology, and the association of Catholicism with national identity, protection of borders, hostility to migration, hostility to LGBT plus rights, and an attitude to abortion to make that as restrictive as possible. So all of these areas of policy that came together and were often intertwined in different ways with the policies and rhetoric in the economic area. But what we focus on in our chapter on the culture wars that PiS engaged in, and to some degree the well-known cultural backlash that PiS is responding to, so the sense among certain voters that society was moving in a progressive direction in a way that left them feeling disoriented and fearful, was that when PiS came to power and started to act upon some of these ideas, at least rhetorically, as in making the rhetorical climate more hostile for LGBT plus minorities, its action on migration, and its indirect action through a captured court to restrict what was already a restrictive access to abortion in Poland in 2020. That all of this, in the end, contributed to PiS's downfall and created what we discuss as a kind of backlash to the backlash. So the idea that a kind of ideological overreach of a party in power that's actually able to act on some of the ideas that it might talk about in a kind of fear-mongering discourse when in power could have the reverse effect on the electorate and actually contribute to a decline in support for the party. So this sense that develops from 2020 onwards that this is a party in simple terms that's gone too far in a whole range of questions. And we see this with the turning point really for the PiS government of October 2020 and the abortion protests during the first major wave of the COVID pandemic that erupted in Poland, and was the moment really where support for the PiS government fell and never recovered before the 2023 election. So we look at a range of issues in which this culture war rhetoric ceased to have the same effect as it did early in PiS's time in power and before it came to power, and perhaps actually, and there's a significant amount of evidence to suggest this, began to have an opposite effect. Although it depends on issue. This is a question where we have to examine this issue by issue, because that's certainly the case with respect to abortion law, to some degree the case with respect to LGBT plus rights, where PiS stopped trying to mobilize this issue to the same degree after 2020, with an understanding that it was no longer effective, or in fact may have even had a negative effect on support for the party. But on the issue of migration, we see something rather different. This is an issue that PiS clearly won, and it's another issue where the liberal government of Donald Tusk after 2023 and the coalition before coming to power felt obliged to co-opt PiS's policies in order to win those elections. We then move on, and we're running short of time, so I might cut this short and go back to Ben. But the next chapter in the book is about PiS's politics of history and of security and sovereignty, and the way that all of these questions are connected to each other. So Poland's sovereignty under threat from, on the one hand, Russia and its revanchist aggression, and on the other hand, from the European Union and sort of supposed restrictions to Poland's sovereignty as a member state, and the way in which PiS would deliver this rhetoric in terms of Poland's history. And so here we refer to Jarosław Kuisz's concept of a post-traumatic sovereignty. So the idea that Poland is deeply shaped by its history of its very existence and not being something that could be taken for granted. So we can discuss perhaps the politics of history, which is in itself a very interesting subject if there are questions about that. But just to move to the last point that I'll discuss, and that is of PiS's. Sorry, Ben, you can. Thank you. PiS's defeat. So an important sort of argument in the center of the book is really to attempt to establish how it is that a popular illiberal party like PiS falls from power. There, of course, a range, so how illiberals can be defeated. We now see a number of examples of this. It's interesting to bring together the Polish case with the more recent example of Hungary. And it's a combination, we find in our analysis, of a range of sort of external shocks and factors entirely beyond the party's control. So especially the COVID pandemic, the economic downturn that follows that, and even more so the energy crisis and deepening of that economic downturn after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. So here we see this distinction between PiS's period of pomp of 2017 to around 2020, where the Polish economy and confidence in the Polish economy among voters is higher really than it's ever been at any period since 1989, and then the decline that follows. So simply these external factors combined with various political missteps and the ideological overreach that we've already described. And then we have a discussion of the opposition strategy and how that was significant as well in the 2023 result, and the particular configuration of the coalition that Donald Tusk assembled, partly by accident, the way that configuration fell in three major groupings that gave voters wishing to vote against peace a number of different ideological and policy options to choose from. So we can return to that question if those who are interested in how a party like Peace falls from power as well, but it's clearly a key part of the book.
Yeah, so we should stress at this point that defeat here is, in inverted commas, advisedly, because Law and Justice returned, it won the election in the sense of gaining a plurality of votes. It simply didn't have the coalition partners that would allow it to form a government. And what Stan was just mentioning about the diverse nature of the coalition really feeds into the essential weaknesses of the subsequent government in the post-peace era. It's had to deal with a significant degree of ideological heterogeneity within the government, while at the same time trying to deal with the consequences of transition. So, after having set out essentially what the good change was and the ways in which it was elaborated, we then came to consider, with the prospect of a change of government in mind, what consequences this might have in terms of how we can understand this and conceptualize this in a way which is more tractable for comparative analysis. There is much about what happened in Poland that is based on specific factors that were important to Poland during the period of post-communist transition, but also much which, as subsequent events have shown, has been of comparative relevance. And we draw on literature on what has been termed either sort of democratic careening or democratic swerving to characterize what has happened in Poland, not so much as a case of backsliding as to rather a series of shifts in a two-dimensional space that we characterize in the book thus. So the typical backsliding, consolidating continuum goes from a sort of condition of full monism, where there is low inclusion of the populace and only weak constraints on power. So essentially where elites are able to govern in a top-down autocratic fashion without really facing many constraints. The idea of it being that democracy inheres in the consolidation of a condition of full pluralism, where we have strong constraints on power and at the same time a high inclusion of the populace. What we argue in the Polish case occurred was that during the initial period of transition that peace, Law and Justice took as its point of contention and criticism, that what we had was a flawed democracy, which we characterize as a form of representational monism. On the one hand, it was constrained by significant and powerful liberal institutions. At the same time, it failed adequately to incorporate large sections of the electorate, as exemplified in the 2005 elections in Poland, where only 40% of the electorates went and voted. By the elections of 2023, somewhere in the order of 74% of the electorate was voting. So clearly there were more people who felt that there was something to vote for and that they had some stake in democracy. What we argue peace was, Law and Justice was involved in doing, was, on the one hand, undermining constraints on power through the creation of this system of executive aggrandizement and the bypassing of key institutions, and at the same time, through its social programs and through its political rhetoric, creating a greater sense of inclusion of the populace on the part of those who had reason to feel, or could be persuaded to feel, as if they had been excluded from post-89 transition to democracy. So this is the way in which we conceptualize this in the Polish case that also travels to other cases that we might observe of a similar phenomena occurring in countries such as Hungary. We then set out at the end of the book to look at the question of what comes next. What happens in particular, and this was something that coincided with us writing the last part of the book. What happens after this? It became likely, sort of, when we were writing the final chapters of the book, that we would see a change of government, and that this would have significant consequences, not only for the reason that a change of government genuinely does, but also because the new government was going to have to govern in conditions that were significantly affected by what its predecessor had done. The problem that the government that came into power, the current Tusk-led government, had in 2023 was that it appealed to the electorate on the basis of restoring democracy, that it was going to come back in and was going to essentially deal with the problems that it had inherited. The problem that it faced is that in attempting to do so, it was much more constrained than its predecessor had been. And this we set out in subsequent work as well, in an article in Journal of Democracy, as what we term the post-illiberal trilemma. The idea that illiberal governments bequeath to their successors a difficult situation in the sense that they have to stand up for and defend the liberal democratic institutions and norms that they were elected in order to defend, but that in doing so, they're often constrained by the need to act swiftly to undo some of the key changes that have been made before even more illiberal facts on the ground are established. They need to act legally in order to be in accordance with their key liberal democratic credentials and principles. But they also need to act effectively. They need to be able to act in a way which is actually dealing with the key problems that they've inherited. And the key problem that we identify in the Polish case, which is something that could well have significant consequences for other post-illiberal cases, such as in the case of Hungary, is that acting quickly and effectively requires you to bend the law in order to do so. To act legally and effectively means that you lose those swift reflexes that allow you to make the quick changes that are demanded by international institutions and by your own electorate. To act legally and to act quickly sacrifices effectiveness. There's little that you can do that there is consensus for you to do in a short space of time. And so the key problem that one of the key consequences of the good change is not just what happened from 2015 to 2023, but the specific set of structural problems that a period of post-illiberal governance has bequeathed to its successors. So we conclude ultimately, both in the book and in subsequent work that we've done since, by essentially characterizing what we saw from 2015 to 2023 in Poland, not as a sort of a populist interregnum between conditions of liberal democratic normality, but a fundamental change in the form of democratic governance in a democracy such as Poland, whereby not only institutions have been undermined and norms have been changed, but people's understandings and expectations with respect to what democracies can and should do have been fundamentally altered. Law and justice has changed much of the substance of what Polish politicians, both government and opposition, consider possible and desirable, and has also changed much about how governments are able to think about the way in which they can govern, what shortcuts they can legitimately use without being punished by their electorates. Stan, you have any final thoughts?
Closing
Or shall we
thoughts?
move to?
Yes, I think we'd love to hear from Alexandra, and thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. Thanks, Stanley and Ben, for the great overview of your research there and how that fits into the global context that we find ourselves in today with competing visions of democracy and growing rhetoric around cultural, social conservatism that you huge role in there as well. We will now turn to our expert discussant with us today, Alexandra Sojka, for her thoughts, reflections, and any questions you might have as well for Stanley and Ben. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for the invitation and thanks for having me as the discussant for this magnificent book. I have it here, and I have had it on my shelf for a while, willing to read it. I couldn't find always the time to fully kind of get on with the details. So I appreciate also this opportunity to that oblige me to go deeper, not only kind of superficially read it. And it has been a real pleasure. I think this is basically the single best account that we have of what has happened in Poland in the last decade or so. And I think I also want to highlight here that there is a specific position that I am approaching this book from, and also I think that is something that I shared with the authors, and that is that we are both kind of insiders and outsiders of Poland and Polish politics. I am originally Polish, but I have been working and living outside of Poland for the whole of the good change and even previously, as I have actually left Poland with the first Kaczynski government. So I have been kind of observing what was going on in Poland in these last years, kind of from afar. And so I kind of, as the authors, sit a bit outside of the story. And I think I was very much impressed by your capability to kind of approach this from both a very empathetic point of view to Poland, to Polish voters, to Poles in general, Polish culture, Polish politics, which can be sometimes very, very frustrating. As we know, it's very polarized. It's very sometimes it might read as full of crazy people saying crazy things. But what I really liked about the book is how you kind of approach all of this with empathy, with kind of this from this position of trying to understand both sides, let's say, and kind of keep a kind of an open mind, if you will, to the arguments and the kind of the things that were happening in Poland, because Poland has been kind of, especially in international debates, very often has been presented as this kind of as you were saying in your presentation, what's going on with the Poles? They should be happy because they have had phenomenal economic growth. It's been such a huge success. How are they now turning to these populist kind of nativist, conservative politicians that are undermining their hardly fought for democracy, right? So I think the first thing I really appreciated in the book is how empathetically you kind of come to this and try to unravel what has happened in Poland. And this of course you can also tell that you're intimately kind of aware of everything that was going on in Poland, that you are absolutely I have kind of lived through this experience of good change, again from afar, but also always very closely following Polish politics, and I was kind of very impressed by how you were able to tell a very nuanced, a very detailed story, a very well documented story. I mean, if somebody wants to have the book just for documenting everything that has been written about Poland and Polish politics and Polish economy, this is the book for you. Even just like the one place where you have everything that has been produced in terms of scholarship kind of organized, that's already worth it. But what I want to say is that I really appreciate this lack of I would say even sometimes it felt like it was a condescending approach from especially Western commentators on Poland, treating it as, you know, a student of democracy that has failed. Poles didn't understand what democracy was about. And instead, in your book, I really appreciate that you talk about it as a kind of almost like a laboratory for what is going on more broadly in the world, right? These forces of modernization, globalization. You also connect it to this emerging cleavage of integration and demarcation, and I will talk about that in a moment. So I think in these terms, this book is phenomenal, not only because it's so detailed and provides such an comprehensive and exhausting account of political history of Poland after the transition, and especially with spotlight on the so-called period of the good change, but also because you do it in such a kind of empathetic and nuanced and kind of sensitive, let's say, way, without pointing to the kind of the bad guys and the good guys, but rather saying, well, you know, this is what happened, and we're trying to understand it from the different or through the different elements, as you have pointed out in the presentation. And then the other thing that I wanted to say in terms of the praise for the book is that, well, I think even on the cover of the book, some of the kind of scholars recommending the book say, oh, it's absolutely necessary to read this book to understand Polish politics, Central Eastern European politics. But I would say it's actually necessary to read if you want to understand European politics more broadly, because and you're hinting at it in the book itself. What you're discussing and what you're describing is to a great extent this materialization of the kind of integration, demarcation, cleavage that is playing out across Europe, not only in Central Eastern European countries. So this kind of pressure on democracy based on this emerging cleavage is something that we can find in other places. And I think the Polish case, how you analyze it, how you kind of show the deep interactions between these different elements is kind of very thoughtful and very useful also for understanding what is going on in other places in Europe. And in these terms, I think the good change is this kind of almost like a perfect demarcation coalition, right? We have the kind of oh my God, now I forgot one English word, which is risk or kind of threat. I think now I remember it. Threat from outside. Okay, that is motivates the need for closing of the community, of protecting its borders, for also protecting the traditions, morally protecting even the community, and restoring its kind of prestige and sovereignty as defined against both Brussels and Moscow, as you have mentioned previously. So I think this is something that can be read in, or can be found in other places in Europe, and you also make some comparisons even to Trump's US or Brexit Britain, which I think are very illustrative, because the differences also tell us something about the kind of the context or the reasons why this project has specifically thrived in Poland. So what I find most interesting here is that and I think this is something that has been very often misunderstood outside of Poland, is how this combination of left and right politics has worked very well for peace, and to what extent they identified these unmet need in the Polish society in terms of redistributive justice and this kind of more social support from the state through welfare policy. And they used it to their advantage to politicize something that has been, and I think that's very important to understand outside of Poland, outside of Central Eastern Europe, to politicize something that has been deeply unpoliticized, right? Because of this, because of the kind of agreement that we had that the shock therapy and the kind of liberal market project was the only way to go. There was no alternative, right? So I think in these terms, this has a lot of carries a lot of interest for students of European politics in general, because it shows us kind of the dangers of not understanding what current changes, both in the economic model, but also more broader cultural changes can mean for European societies. And in these terms, I don't think that Poland is like a kind of odd kind of case, or it's very much a representative of these broader trends and kind of changes that are happening in Europe. And so in these terms, I think this book that's why I was saying, I think it's very important and it's also useful not only to understand Poland, Central Eastern Europe, but also understanding Europe more broadly. And one thing that I must say I missed a little bit in the book is a deeper kind of engagement with the real almost material, but also psychological costs of transition. Because when I read your book, I immediately understood the appeal of the kind of moral revolution that peace was offering. But in your book, it's mostly framed as something that is kind of value-driven, connected to the politics of history, the kind of historically determined or historically structured ways of thinking about the Polish community. And then it seems like the redistributive part is kind of just like an add-on to all of that helped reach out beyond a little bit the most conservative loyalist supporters of peace. But I think it's actually so much deeper than that, because I mean, I have grown up in Poland in the 80s, in the 90s. I have seen my parents, I have seen my grandparents deal with the transition. And basically, this has been such a deep and deeply traumatizing for the society, I think, experience that was not something that was acknowledged in Polish politics for a very long time. And basically we have, as you very rightly say in your book, we have adopted this kind of stance that, you know, if you are a loser, I mean, a loser in the terms of winners and losers of transition, if you don't manage to fare well in these new conditions, it's like entirely on you. You're just not a good person, right? Because it was so ingrained in how we were thinking about the society following the post 1989 changes. So this has created this deep resentment, and this has created also, I think, deep vulnerability in the Polish society, and almost like the community that was created through the democratic transition and the transition to market economy was so focused on individualism and individual kind of merit and making it in the capitalist economy, that anybody who would not manage to in those conditions was kind of cast out almost, right? So I think in these terms, this is something that you kind of hint at in the book, but you don't like that deeply engage with. And it was even something that I connected with the book, which I'm sure you're aware of and you read, which is Traumaland by Bilewicz. I mean, obviously, he presents it like in a longer kind of historical perspective, but he talks about the 90s as this re-traumatizing event for the Polish society. So it was not only about the fact that, well, Polish elites didn't think about providing a stronger welfare state for Polish society, and voters felt like that was something that was lacking. But rather, I feel like there was this deep material, but also almost like psychological vulnerability of Polish society, especially among the people who didn't fare so well during the transition. And I think this is something that if a Polish reader reads it, we know this, right? This is not something you need to explain to me. But I think because the book is such a great opportunity for foreign readers to understand what really happened in Poland, and again with this very empathetic approach, I think maybe it was a bit, treated too lightly from my perspective. Okay, so I see I'm running out of time, so I want to ask two questions to the authors. First question kind of stems from my specialization, which is in European politics, EU politics, because throughout the book you mention the EU. Of course, I mean you cannot not mention the EU in relation to peace, and it's the whole kind of conflict about rule of law, the European Commission, etc. However, what I wanted to ask you is, what do you think was the role of this broadly pro-EU predisposition of the Polish society towards during the kind of good change era? Because what you say in the book is that on the one hand, Poles remained pro-EU, but on the other hand, the kind of polarizing politics on the EU have had this deeper impact in creating kind of a structure or a basis for questioning of the impact of European integration on Polish sovereignty. And now it seems that Polish voters might be a bit more worried about that, even if they still remain very supportive of the EU. So my first question is that, do you think that then it was a constraint for peace? Do you think that then the EU is a fundamentally constitutes this kind of fundamental constraint for the politics of integration and demarcation? Is it just like maybe just a specific situation in Poland? And then the second question very quickly was, of course, what do you think about your closing argument saying that it was a defeat, as you said, it wasn't a full defeat of peace, but you very rightly anticipated all of these problems. So I just was wondering, how do you see the contribution and the conclusion of the book in light of what we have seen that has happened since the election of Nawrocki as president, but also as we have seen what has happened in Hungary, to what extent it validates kind of your analysis in Poland. So thank you so much, and sorry for spending a few minutes over time.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. I mean, it's such a generous presentation of the book, and really sort of in a way presenting what our intention was in writing it. So it is really gratifying that's at least to some extent palpable for a reader of the book. So thank you very much. So if I just quickly answer the question, maybe about the EU, and Ben can handle the other question, but just quickly to respond also to your suggestion about the deeper engagement with the material and psychological costs of the transition. And you're right that really in terms of the effect of that neoliberal period, and we cover that in a section in the nativist economics chapter, and yeah, to some extent, I think we both would like to have had more space for it, and it is a really interesting and important factor. I think one reason why we ended up framing it the way we did is simply because the survey data just consistently shows in Poland that the cultural questions are more decisive on voter choice than economic questions. So they're there. But I think one of the problems with that is that that they're actually intertwined, right? So questions of cultural status are inseparable from questions of income, from questions of economies falling out of small town areas, for instance, in Poland in particular, right? So the idea that sort of major factories and other sort of job providing institutions in large parts of the country disappeared in the 1990s, and there was a total restructuring that happened. So in many ways, they're not really separable from the cultural questions. But in terms of what the survey data tends to show, it really does suggest that peace voters really focus more on those cultural questions. But what we really tried to get at in the chapter is very specifically how they're intertwined and the contribution that the different issues made both to voters' choices, but then to the success of the party. But I entirely agree with you that it's such an important question, and we probably could have given more attention to it, right, to the devastation of those years from the point of view of many voters in many regions in Poland, and how important that was in the phenomenon of the good change. So maybe more on that in future publications. But thank you. I think it's a very, very fair comment. Very briefly on the EU question before Ben concludes with the second question. So the pro-EU attitude of Polish society, I think, was a constraint on peace's field of action. EU institutions, despite their multiple failures, and of course the European Union is criticized, and rightly so in the case of Hungary in particular, but also Poland, for being late in acting and not very effective in some of the action that was taken. But nevertheless, there were instruments that various European institutions used that did very, very concretely constrain the field of action in various areas of the peace government. So particularly the Court of Justice of the European Union in the early phase, acting to curtail various aspects of the judicial reforms. And then, of course, the rule of law conditionality and the freezing of European funds, which was a factor that mobilized some voters in the 2023 elections. May not have been the most important, but it was a factor. And I think it did lead to a certain kind of restraint of the peace government in certain fields, knowing the strongly pro-European disposition of Polish society more widely. But I think the key question is what you highlighted in the context of that question, and that is significant trajectory of change over even the last few years, right? And that change will, of course, continue as Poland becomes potentially a net contributor to the European budget rather than a net beneficiary. And we see the rise of the much more strongly anti-EU radical right parties that are in fact taking some of peace's vote share, or may do, if we place credence in the current polling. And so I think there is a change. And it sort of started as a sense that European membership is very good, but there is a significant constituency of the population, nevertheless, that doesn't want deeper integration of any kind, or thinks integration has gone too far, whilst still remaining broadly supportive of membership. And that was quite an important constituency of the vote that peace was mobilizing in 2023, but with an answering and equally probably proportioned constituency of voters for the Tusk coalition, who precisely saw peace as a threat to Poland's security because of the risk of some Polexit that might happen in the future. So that very strong embrace of European Union membership and even potentially deeper integration. But there is an unfolding trajectory. I think you're absolutely right about this, and it is changing quickly. And therefore, I don't think it's unimaginable that in the coming years there could be a party that is even part of a ruling coalition that is openly campaigning for Polexit, something that would have been difficult to imagine not too long ago for a serious party of potentially of power.
Yeah, I think just on that last point, I think it needs qualifying with the observation that What we saw during the period of peace being in office and attitudes towards the EU and to its institutions, to an extent, this was thermostatic in character. The threat of poll exit, the spectre of poll exit that was raised during, certainly during the second term of peace being in office, seemed to help stimulate pro-EU attitudes rising to levels even by Polish standards, which were higher than they had been. Whereas we saw in during the period of the previous government, levels of support for EU integration at times falling to the low 70s, as they have subsequently. So there is an extent to which the sense of poll exit no longer being a threat does free up some of the electorate to take somewhat more skeptical views. When that threat returns, we see attitudes rebounding to higher levels. So I think that also has to be taken into consideration. So I'm somewhat skeptical about the voices that have been raised recently about this growing threat of poll exit on the basis of a couple of surveys, because we have seen this fluctuation in the past. On the question of the sort of the closing arguments of the book and extending those further into what's happened since, with events such as the rise of the far right, as Stan alluded to, and also the victory of Nawrocki, I think it is important to stress, as you did when asking the question, that this was at best a partial defeat for peace, and in many respects, what occurred in 2023 was, while on the one hand a rejection of an increasingly unpopular government, at the same time an endorsement of the fact that during those years, PiS had established itself as the hegemonic party in Polish politics, from the perspective of being able to essentially make its positions and its rhetoric the default to which all other parties had to respond. That is perhaps breaking down a little now on the right, as different sort of contesting forces have started to emerge. And Nawrocki is a case in point. He's not sort of the extension of Jarosław Kaczyński's will in the same way that that Andrzej Duda was, his predecessor. But I think that what was important about the 2023 election, and went somewhat under the radar, certainly in the international coverage of it, was that it, at the same time as it confirmed the backlash against peace on the part of the larger part of the electorate, it also highlighted that there was and still remains significant support for the kinds of policies that PiS were offering, and the mode of governance that it instantiated between 2015 and 2023. So I think that the closing arguments of the book, which essentially boil down to it's now PiS's world and we all have to live in it, still apply and still govern much of what we've seen in the subsequent period, and will continue to do so into the next election.
Sorry, I just meant to say that there you have a great title for a future article.
It's PiS's world.
Yeah, we'll know that.
Yeah. Thanks, Alexandra.
Oh, well, thank you all. Thank you for this excellent panel, and Alexandra, for your insights and your questions as well. It was really great to hear from your experience and your research as we unpacked it a bit more. And well, we have time maybe just for one question, I think. And I was looking at the questions we have in the Q&A. One I think was answered in your discussion just there. So we have one which is quite specific. So let's see. It says, thank you very much for a nice presentation. You described the 50 plus as a nativist policy. Would you consider the German Kindergeld, which is the same policy or similar, I suppose, to be nativist as well, to have that same weight, or to be comparable, I think is what the question is trying to ask.
I don't know enough about that policy to compare, but so I don't have an opinion on the German Kindergeld. But I would just say I don't think a child benefit policy is a nativist policy per se in itself. That's not what we're saying. We're talking about the specific framing of that policy by peace before it came to power in the election campaign, and then subsequently. But no, it's not. I mean, it's not necessarily a nativist policy, but many of the policies of redistribution that peace instituted, it framed in a way that intertwined these policies with its positions on cultural issues.
And I think that in some quarters of the right, it has been perceived as such. I mean, there are current debates about the extent to which, for example, Ukrainians who came after the full-scale war broke out in 2022, the extent to which they should also be the beneficiaries of policies such as these. So, but in that sense, I think it's no more susceptible to this kind of welfare chauvinism than other similar policies in other European countries. And I don't think its initial intention was sort of overridingly nativist in intent. It had a pronatal
or
aspect.
natalist.
Yeah, so it had a natalist aspect to it. It was essentially intended to try to deal with Poland's demographic issues, and also
which it did not do.
Which it didn't do, but also to deal with problems of child poverty, which it has had some successes of dealing with. So in that sense, it was a policy that was intended to deal with some key problems that previous governments had sort of dismissed as too difficult for us to deal with, or would produce too many sort of countervailing effects, and has become part of the policy, or the standard policy repertoire of pretty much any party that might aspire to govern Poland. One measure of the fact of whether it is a nativist policy is, could a non-nativist party get rid of it? And my answer would be no, not if that party wants to have a chance of winning an election and governing in Poland. It's part of the ordinary fabric of public policy in Poland now.
We'll look into the Kindergeld.
Yeah.
Yes, noted. Well, I hope, yes, I'm sure that did, and I hope that answered the question for the anonymous.
Of course, the same policy is in the UK has a child benefit program, which is unlike the Polish one, is means limited, right? So it's a sort of distinction.
And well, we had some thanks in the chat, and the other question, as I say, you actually answered. It was around the EU peace conflict, the dimension there in your book. So yes, that was great. And we'll thank you again. With that, we'll bring things to a close, and huge thanks to you, Stanley, to Ben, to Alexandra, for your time today on behalf of the EU Values Network. It was great. And just for anyone that would like to rewatch parts or send this to somebody that couldn't attend today, we will put this on YouTube in the coming days. So yeah, subscribe and you'll find it there. Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Emily, and thanks, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Alexandra, thank you.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
You too. Bye.
Bye.